Good evening, everyone. It's a joy to be with you. This is a subject that I'm incredibly passionate about because this was really the subject that brought me to following Jesus. This was what I had to wrestle with early on in my existential crisis to understand what was true about the claims of Christianity. And so this has been this question, did Jesus rise from the dead, that I have been wrestling with since I was 17 years old. Close to the age of many of you in this room. And it's a question that absolutely transformed and changed my life. And it's something that I want to address primarily tonight from a historical basis, from asking the question, did Jesus rise from the dead, from a historical understanding. I understand that many of us wrestle with questions of faith that are beyond historical, but that's what we're going to address tonight. So if you are a Christian in this room, this is going to be a night for you to gain some insight and understanding about how historians, whether Christian or skeptic, understand the historical evidence for the resurrection. If you're someone who disagrees with this question itself and says, how could this happen in this world that a person could rise from the dead? It makes no sense from your worldview. That's okay. We're excited you're here to process this question with us. But this is the question that I truly believe has the most significance for us as human beings. This question, did Jesus rise from the dead? And so we're going to jump into it. What's wild to me is when we address this question, Christianity is the only world religion that has its very foundation on a verifiable, credible, historical statement. The fact that Jesus rose from the dead from a Christian worldview is what the Christian worldview is based upon. In fact, the New Testament writers like Paul himself says, if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then Christianity, guess what is? Does anyone know the answer? It's meaningless. It's vanity. Christianity doesn't exist unless Christ physically rose from the dead. And so when I began to examine this question as someone searching the faith, I began to come to the realization of this is not true historically. Then Christianity itself absolutely falls apart, and Jesus is not a worthy person to follow, and his claims about divinity are absolutely not true. And so this is the exploration that we are going to head into tonight. Now, I need to start with a caveat. I'm going to throw up a slide that might be a little overwhelming to look at. Forgive me for that. But this is the slide that basically comes with, these are the verifiable historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And you see there's 12 major claims there. The claim that Jesus died, he was buried, the disciples were discouraged and abandoned him. The tomb was empty. The disciples report experiences that they saw him. They proclaimed the resurrection. They accounted for the disciples' lives being transformed. They were preaching and teaching these experiences in the very city Jesus was crucified. The number of converts grew. The gospel message centered on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the conversion of James and Paul. These are major historical statements that we're making. But you'll see that some of them are underlined. And the ones that are underlined are the ones that, whether you're a Christian scholar or a skeptic scholar, these are the statements that scholars across the board would say are verifiably true. These are the statements that, whether you come from a Christian worldview or a secular worldview, historians would claim these to be true. And so, for example, a New Testament scholar like Bart Ehrman, who completely disagrees that Jesus rose physically from the dead, he would still say these statements that are underlined in here are credible historically and actually give evidence from the accounts of history. And so what I want to do tonight, and again, don't be overwhelmed by this first slide, but I pointed out because what I want to do tonight is take these statements that you see underlined there and begin to build a case for the historicity of the resurrection that historians, whether Christian or secular, would begin to agree and hold to as true. And to do that, I'm gonna base us in four sort of distinct categories of evidence. And I bring these just because they're easy to memorize. I bring these because they're easy for us to comprehend. And the four sort of statements that I want to make historically tonight is focusing on Jesus died, that Jesus was executed on the cross by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. I want to talk about the experiences that the first followers of Jesus had in experiencing Christ risen from the dead. I want to talk about the early dates of the manuscripts, which clarify what the early church believed about Jesus. And then fourthly, the eyewitness testimonies that absolutely transformed the Greco-Roman world, spreading into the rest of the Roman Empire. And so we're really going to be looking at these four facts. Again, there's 12 that we could address. And there's a book by Gary Habermas that addresses these 12 questions, and it's 900 pages long, okay? So we're not even going to have a time to get to like the minuscule evidence for the history of the resurrection. And so that gives you a glimpse of just like basic research. A book that came out 2 years ago is 900 pages just addressing those 12 historical claims. We're going to talk about primarily 4 tonight. And so the first one, let's look at the execution of Jesus. A historical fact that we come to realize, whether again secular or Christian, is that Jesus was crucified and that he died on the cross. The American Medical Association in 1986, they did a study which basically examined the historical evidence for Christ's endurance of suffering. And they did a study on Christ's crucifixion, and the literature that came out in this medical field describes this brutal death that Christ endured, involving possible mechanisms that included asphyxiation that Jesus endured, shock, trauma-related complications, and one forensic review even argued that the traumatic shock complicated this blood clotting in the body of Jesus, which actually may have been a key contributor to his death. But this medical research that was done clarified that there's no way that Jesus could have survived what led up to the crucifixion, and especially the crucifixion itself. And the New Testament is absolutely unified on this point of Christ's crucifixion. And it was the very foundation for what they began to say and teach about Jesus himself. Another point of historical evidence that we have that's quite fascinating is the very first graffiti that sort of mocked Christianity was a picture of what they call Alexamenos graffiti. And it's this picture which states that this is Alexamenos worshiping his God. And what's it a picture of? It's a picture of someone dying on the cross, Jesus, and what does he have on his head? What's he depicted as? A donkey's ass, right? This was a mocking of the crucifixion of Jesus. And yet it tells something very crucial historically. It tells us from very early on that how Christianity was defined and understood was understanding a deified being crucified on a cross. And this is not only what the early church claimed to believe, this is also what they were incredibly mocked and ridiculed for. This is another key points of evidence that the disciples and the early followers of Jesus and history itself claim that Jesus died. Now, I'm not going to spend a bunch more time on this point because the majority of scholars, again, secular, Christian, all believe that Jesus was died and crucified. The only worldview that really challenges this historical reality, can anyone guess what worldview challenges this belief? Islam. Because Islam believes that Jesus was a prophet who never died. And so they believe in something called the swoon theory, where that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but he was removed from the cross. But again, these are writings that happened 600 years after the historical event itself. And so we can talk more about that if you have questions in Q&A, but this is the primary belief, beginning with understanding the resurrection. Historically, we understand that Jesus was died and was crucified. He was executed to death while at the same time claiming to be divine. Now, the second fact that, again, secular historians would adhere to as well is the experiences of the early followers of Jesus. The disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. And I clarify that this is something they believe to be true. We can talk about whether it's verifiably true in a little bit, but this is something they believe to be true. And we can have some questions around this. And some of the questions that have been proposed to this common fact idea is that, well, maybe the disciples just hallucinated. Maybe this was something that they saw, and they thought of physical being, but in reality, it was just a hallucination that they had as a group in time and space. But this is something that we realize even in our modern research, and modern psychology has this, that there has not been one verified account in history of psychology that confirms the possibility of collective hallucinations, all seeing the same image in the same physical form. The disciples, another example of what could this have been is the disciples lied about this. This is sort of called the conspiracy theory, where the disciples lied about seeing Jesus and they made it up. The problem with that theory is that these were historic Jews. And the Jewish people didn't have a category of worldview to say that an individual would rise from the dead. There were groups of Judaism that had an idea perhaps of resurrection, but their concept of any possibility of resurrection was that one day at the end of history, there would be a resurrection of God's people. And it would be collective. And they would go into a place called Abraham's bosom, which is sort of this picture of heaven. So they had no category for an individual person of history to be raised from the dead. And so for them to lie about this, first of all, it doesn't even fit their own worldview. And secondly, this would be something that they are willing to go to their deaths for. We read that the experience of the disciples transformed to the extent that they were willing to die, to be martyred for the belief that they held that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, even with that, you may ask, well, many people die for things that they think are true, that perhaps aren't true. And maybe we could use the example of someone in a communist country who is dying for the cause of communism, or a Buddhist who dies for the cause of Buddhism. But what's different about this story is that all these other martyrs that we've experienced throughout history have died for a worldview that has already been established for them. Whereas these early disciples didn't die for a worldview. Why? Because what Jesus did in rising from the dead actually completely challenged and eradicated their worldview. They died for something that they saw in history. They died not just to defend a worldview that they had, they died for an event they saw in history. Also, they had nothing to gain for lying about this historical event. Instead, they actually had everything to lose. And so we have these ideas that Jesus' disciples experienced something that were public and varied. The New Testament text in 1 Corinthians 15, which we're going to analyze in quite a bit of detail in a minute, it tells us that Jesus appeared to over 500 people in many different forms and fashions of space. And so we read time and time again the earliest evidence. They defended that Jesus appeared physically. He appeared not just to his followers, but Jesus also appeared to skeptics, even to enemies. There's an entire story about a person named Doubting Thomas who completely disbelieved the witness of the women and the disciples at the early tomb, and they said, Thomas said, I don't believe this. And yet we have his story throughout history. We see a wild experience of James, the half-brother of Jesus, who told Jesus himself in the historical accounts of the New Testament that he said, Jesus is insane. His family rejected this idea that he was the Messiah, that he was divine, and yet James converts after the resurrection. We see the historical person, the Apostle of Paul, who wrote 13 letters of the New Testament, 6 of which even secular scholars would agree as historical. And in those accounts that even secular scholars adhere to, we read that Paul defines himself as someone who was antagonistic against the church and was actually actively seeking to destroy and murder the early followers of Jesus. And yet we see an absolute life transformation take place with him. And so we see these appearances that are physical and tangible then actually transform the experiences of people themselves. The historian N.T. Wright, he's probably one of the most prominent New Testament scholars in the world today. And he writes this, he's right, the early Christians did not invent the empty tomb and the meetings or sightings of the risen Jesus. He says, nobody was expecting this kind of thing. No kind of conversion experience would have invented it, no matter how guilty or how forgiven they felt. No matter how many hours they poured over the scriptures, to suggest otherwise is to stop doing history and enter into a fantasy world of our own. Third point, early dates. This is where I'm going to have some fun with us. The resurrection proclamation was extremely early. And so when we talk about a historical event, there's sort of 2 big E words that we should be thinking of for its credibility. The first one we just sort of mentioned a little bit, which we're going to talk more in detail next. But eyewitnesses and early dates. If you want to know if something is credible historically, those are 2 major categories we need to function under. Early dates, eyewitnesses. And so when it comes to the claims of Christ's resurrection, what are we looking date-wise for evidence to understand if this is something that could happen historically? Well, to do this, I need a few volunteers. I need probably 5 or 6 of us. Who's up for it? This guy's out here. You come down. You're set. All right, you come down too. We need 4 more probably. Josh is coming. Okay, you're going to be ground zero, okay? You stand like right here, sort of even close to the door. So we need 3 more still. I know you guys want to get up.
Come on, guys.
Yeah.
I'm doing it.
So we're going to say this is ground zero. And when I say ground zero, what I'm talking about, this is the historical date of Christ's death. Okay? So most scholars place it around AD 30, some around AD 33. Okay? Now, how many gospel accounts of the story of Jesus are there? Does anyone know? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, right? Apart from the 4 gospels, we also have some what's called epistles, which talk about the letters that were written to the church explaining some of these historical events as well. Some of the epistles were written before the gospels, but the gospels are sort of the main primary sources for how we understand the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so there's a few. So if this is ground zero, we're talking about 0 as in AD 30. So when do we think that the Gospel of Mark, which historians think was the first gospel account written, where do we think on the timeline that would be? How many years? Any guesses or thoughts? 72 years later? Lower? Oh, 72 AD? Around there. That's actually a really good guess. You know what you're talking about. So we're talking about like, yeah, he knows what he's talking about. Sweet. So Mark's like 70 to 72. So we're talking about like 35 to 40 years later. So someone just be Mark. How about your Mark? You're going to take 4 steps from him, okay? So go there and just take 4 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's the Gospel of Mark. When we talk about the Gospel of Matthew, which was the next sort of historical one, where do we think historically, how many years after the life and death and burial of Jesus are we talking? 50 years? Yep, that's pretty much dead on. So you're going to take 1 step from here, and you're going to be the Gospel of Matthew, okay? Yeah, 1 step this way. Okay, the Gospel of Luke, we're looking around 85. So you're going to come here, and you're going to take a half step because you're tall, okay? And then the Gospel of John is around 95 AD, so about 65 years from the Christ death. And so, Chase, you're going to be about right here. So we have these categories for the gospel accounts. And again, there's some epistles that are even before this. And we would say that when we look at the historical evidence, would we say this is pretty early dates? What are you guys' consensus? In antiquity, it's pretty good. I mean, one of the challenges of the New Testament is that it's sort of criticized sometimes for not having early enough sources. And yet, I want to just pause for a moment and look at another figure of history. I want us to look at the figure of Alexander the Great. And so, Alexander the Great, who knows that Alexander the Great existed? Who knows? What are some evidential things we know about Alexander the Great? What do we believe about him? Yeah, exactly. Conquered the known world, basically, yeah. Yeah, he inspired a movie, there you go. But we would say, we would understand Alexander the Great is a historical person that we would say conquered a lot of the known world at the time. He expressed his dominance. He was this Greek king who literally created one of the largest empires the world had known, all the way from Greece to India. Not only was there a movie after him, there was also a city named after him, right, in Egypt. Very well-known historical figure. So Alexander the Great, he died in 330 BC, okay? So we're talking about way out the room, 330 BC. Christ is at 30 AD. Guess how close the earliest source we have to historically understand Alexander the Great. How many years do you think it comes after his life? 300 years after Alexander the Great. And that's just the known source. What's even more fascinating is the actual historical sources that we use to understand Alexander the Great are Plutarch and Arrian, which is actually 450 years later. So Josh, I need you to just run out that door right now, okay? You're going to be the sources for Alexander the Great, and you're like off campus in the parking lot right now, okay? I'm just joking. You can come back. Okay, great. You guys did awesome. So you guys can go sit down, but this is the concept for how we understand some of the historical documentation of Jesus Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. These are the sources that are coming to basically define the historical understanding for us. Now, if that sort of gives you a framework for understanding the historical event, what if I told you this? I hope that gave you a good visual. But what if I could tell you, and what if I could convince you even, that actually the gospel message that was being proclaimed about Christ's death, burial, and resurrection actually came from 1 to 2 years after the resurrection? Would that blow your minds? If we're talking about Mark about 35, 40 years later, these gospel, what if I told you that we actually have historical evidence for understanding that the proclamation of Christ's resurrection was already being proclaimed and understood a year after Christ's death, burial, and resurrection? Would anyone be shocked by that? Oh, you guys are just... You should be shocked by that. I just told you Alexander the Great was 450 years. 1 year is what we're talking about with Christ. Let me break this down for us. 1 Corinthians 15. This is an oral tradition that's known by the church. This was a letter that Paul wrote to the church in the city of Corinth. And Paul writes some very key historical things in this statement. And I'm going to read it to us. And then I'm going to walk us back through some other evidences for us to point to this reality that even a secular scholar like Bart Ehrman, who's a PhD at UNC, University of North Carolina, probably the most famous skeptic scholar in the New Testament, even he agrees to this evidence. Let me process it for us. Before that, we're going to read 1 Corinthians 15. And if you're someone who's never heard much about Christianity and this is something that you want to understand deeper, this is the earliest oral creedal tradition to define and articulate what Christianity is. This is what Paul says to the church in Corinth. He says, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel," which is just a word that means good news. It was this statement that the Greek world would use when a king arose victorious. They'd enter into the city and the king would be riding on this big horse proclaiming victory, and the people in the Greco-Roman world would be shouting, "Gospel, gospel, good news, good news." It's the statement of Christ's victory. So he says, "I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain." Now here's the key articulation of what Paul says. "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance." What does first importance mean? Everything that Christianity is about is what I'm going to say next. This is the most important thing to know in the entire Christian worldview. This is the very foundation for which the historical evidence of the resurrection is based upon and why we believe it. So he says this, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," which, who knows, that was the Apostle Peter, "and then to the 12, referring to the 12 disciples, apostles. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time." And now that could mean 500 brothers, which meant that it could have been up to 1,000 people, or it could just mean literal the 500 people that were there. The Greek opens up both opportunities. He says, "Most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." When he says asleep, he's not meaning they are sleeping in bed. He's talking about they passed away. And when he says he's appeared to more than 500 at the same time, most of whom are living, what is he saying? What's the invitation he's giving there? The invitation is what? Go ask them. They're still alive. If you want to double check the evidence, if you want to double check what I'm saying, he's saying these people are still alive. These are eyewitnesses that are still in existence today. Go talk to them about what they have witnessed and experienced. Then it says, "Then he appeared to James." James, the half-brother of Jesus. James, again, as I mentioned, the one who walked away and called Jesus insane. James, which fascinatingly enough, historically, we actually have a box of James's bones. It's called an ossuary box. When Jews would die, they'd take their bones and put them in a box. And we actually have an inscription of James, the brother of Jesus. Just a little historical evidence tidbit, but that's a whole other conversation. Then to all the apostles, and then last of all, he appeared also to me. Again, the apostle Paul, he says, as one abnormally born. And he's sort of saying that I shouldn't be part of the family of God, and yet Christ appeared to me and transformed everything. Okay, I said a lot there, but what I want to focus on, how do we come to understand that this early creedal tradition of 1 Corinthians, primarily verses 3 to 8 there, how do we come to understand this has been rooted in the life of the church since the very year after Christ's burial? Richard Bauckham, he's a PhD at Cambridge. And he wrote a fascinating book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And a lot of the research for this is based on his research. But he begins to break down some of the categories of what happened in the life of Paul. And so when we read about Paul having his Damascus experience, which is when Paul experienced the resurrected Christ, the book of Galatians, which again even secular scholars would adhere to as historical evidence, a year or two after the cross in Galatians 1:16 is where we read about Paul experiencing the road to Damascus, seeing Jesus in his resurrected state. And so he experienced that about a year or two after the crucifixion. We also read he spent about 15 days with the leaders Peter and James. He received this material when he visited Jerusalem just 3 years after his conversion. And so both of them, Peter and James, sat down with Paul for 15 days and basically articulated and defended and understood together what they had witnessed and how they understand the story of Jesus now. And this is really this idea of understanding, seeking the evidence, this pursuit of eyewitness evidence that they were all trying to adhere to. Now, the immediate context of that meeting is in Acts chapter 15, if you ever want to deep dive into that subject. But it tells us that they talked for quite a while, and Paul says in Galatians chapter 2, it says, they added nothing to me. In other words, our accounts of the historicity of the resurrection all align together. There was no point of disagreement. There was no point of conflict. There was complete alignment in this belief. And this is something that began to be established. And so we have Paul already 1 to 2 years later meeting with the key leaders of the church, collaborating evidence, saying this is something that's verified in their lives. That's all from Galatians. Now, here, back to 1 Corinthians 15 then, is essentially even all critical scholars agree that Paul is recording an oral tradition here. And the tradition doesn't really match up to us when there's actually a cadence to what's being said here in Greek. We just sort of read it flat out. But the cadence of 1 Corinthians 3:15 was like this. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da-da, right? Who here has worked with teaching kids before? The best way to teach kids and non-literate people is to do cadence stuff, right? Memory work. It's to do something that's memorable. At this point in history, 90% of the Greco-Roman world was illiterate. And so we have this creedal tradition that is cadence-based, that is specifically focusing on the historicity of Christ's resurrection. And Bart Ehrman, again, the skeptic scholar I brought up, he even says this. He says, the idea that Christians were telling stories of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection before Paul, and again, when's Paul's conversion? How many years after the burial of Christ? 1 to 2 years. Bart Ehrman says the idea that Christians were telling stories of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection before Paul is held by virtually all scholars of the New Testament and he even says for compelling reasons. And again, that's a scholar that is not a Christian. And if he were writing today, Paul probably would have footnoted his source that this is actually coming from a tradition that he himself had been given and he himself is passing on. This language, from what I received to you and what I give to you, is putting Paul in the framework of this oral creedal tradition that was passed on to him. Now, I could spend a lot more time on this subject, and you can tell it's one that I'm passionate about, because that to me makes the world of difference. If the historical accounts of Jesus are that early in history, that says something, right? But we got way too much to talk about, and I want to leave time for Q&A as well. So let's jump into the last sort of factual element of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The fourth fact is the eyewitnesses, where the disciples were transformed and the church was birthed. What's wild to me is, where do we see the church massively expand in history? Where did it start? What city? It started in Jerusalem. Where was Jesus crucified? In Jerusalem. The rapid expansion of the church, which is already claiming that Christ has risen from the dead, is in the very place where the entire city witnessed his crucifixion. Isn't that wild to think about? This is the very place that the very message of Jesus. There's a scholar named George Sinclair that says it like this. He says, in the very place where Jesus died and was buried, there was an explosion of growth in the Christian movement, which was centered on the claim that the grave was empty and that Jesus had truly risen. This explosion of growth happened mere weeks after the death and resurrection of Jesus in the place where he died. The growth happened in the face of hostility, opposition, and persecution from civil and religious leaders. Isn't that a wild historical fact just to ponder for a second? At the very place where he was crucified, the most unlikely setting for a message of resurrection to take place, is the very place that it existed in. And what else is wild to me is that this expansion happens in the midst of suffering. This expansion happens in the face of hostility and opposition and persecution. At this point of history, there's no armies behind the Christian movement expanding it. There's no emperors promoting it. There's no kings defending it. There's no money behind it. There's no social leverage to expand it. It's almost this impossible movement. It's a conundrum of history that we are still wrestling with today. And to me, one of the greatest points of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. The fate of the apostles were so transformed, again, that the apostle Peter was willing to be crucified upside down for this belief that Jesus is risen. Paul himself, we read, was beheaded. Thomas was pierced by spears in India. James was killed with the sword. I think James was thrown off the temple, top of the temple too. So we know that they were willing to suffer and die, not for what they hoped was true, but for what they saw and knew to be true. And it's interesting, it wasn't just the early followers of Jesus that experienced this. This is something that the church experienced for the first 300 years of its existence. Under Constantine and the Roman Empire, when Christianity became legalized, it was a different story, but still globally in that period of history, and even globally now, there are still many dying, being martyred for this belief. But again, as I mentioned before, it wasn't a belief that they held previously. This was something that actually challenged their worldview rather than supported it, and they were willing to die for it. This church then expands in a way that expands really throughout the known Greco-Roman world at this point of history. N.T. Wright says this, and the New Testament scholar, it's simple, but it's profound. He says, you don't get revival through crucifixion. The only way you get revival is through resurrection. And what N.T. Wright explains is that in the Jewish movement, there was this, they had all these messianic people that would come before and even after Jesus. And what would happen in those contexts if your Messiah, your Savior is their concept behind it, if your Messiah died, there was only two things that would happen to the movement in history. The first one, the movement would die. Why? Our leader is dead, the movement is dead. The second thing that would happen in history is this Messiah figure would die, and so we would just replace that person with another leader. And what's fascinating to me is that if any logical person would have replaced the crucified Jesus to keep the movement going, it would have been Jesus' brother, James. And yet historically, what do we see James saying? James isn't saying, my brother was a great leader, I'm going to continue the movement and we're going to keep this thing going. No, James says, yeah, he did die. And now we worship him as the eternal king who defeated death. That's a wild concept historically too. Everything that they weren't expecting. So how quickly did the church birth? How fast did it expand? Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, he writes that the church has affected all strata of society. In the end of the 2nd century, Tertullian writes that we are but of yesterday, and we have filled every place among you. Cities, islands, fortresses, towns, marketplace, the very camp, we have left nothing to you but your gods. In other words, Tertullian says we have taken over the Greco-Roman world. Eusebius, a historian, this is around more the 3rd century, he says that the faith has quickly illuminated the whole world. There's congregations in every city and village throughout the empire. The name of Christ is known in every corner of the empire. Modern historian Rodney Stark estimates that around 10%, which was 6 million people in an empire of 60 million people, around 300 Common Era. That's a wild statement. And then he says around AD 150, from a population of 40,000 in the church, rising to about 218,000 in 200, and then 1.17 million by 250 AD. That's wild statistics when you think about it. They completely transformed the world. Another scholar, Joshua Swimidas, says this. He says, without the physical resurrection, 2,000 years of history are left begging for explanation. Like a movie missing a key scene. No other event in all recorded history has reached so far across national, ethnic, religious, linguistic, cultural, political, and geographical borders. The message spread with unreasonable success across the world during just the first few centuries. It spread without political or military power, prevailing against the ruthless efforts of dedicated, organized, and violent opposition. How did a small band of disempowered Jews in an occupied and insignificant territory of ancient Rome accomplish this unequaled act? What happened so many years ago that reframed all of history? And the conclusion that he comes to is the only evidence for a movement like this is that the claims of resurrection must be true. A wild statement. There's a lot more I want to say. I want to jump into Q&A too. I want to make sure we have time for that. I'm super excited for that. But Wolfhart Pannenberg says this. He says, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is so strong that nobody would question it except for two things. First, it's a very unusual event. And to caveat that, I understand that for many of us, as modern people who live in a secular, naturalistic culture, to define anything that is supernatural already goes beyond our worldview. And so it is something that pushes the limitations of our mind at times. It's very unusual and it's very unique because it only happened once in history. And secondly, if you believe it happened, the implication is it has to change the way you live. And that's a very threatening reality to consider. If Jesus actually is who he claimed he said he was, and if he did what he claimed to do, and if he transformed all of human history, that means we adjust our lives to this historical evidence. We don't adjust historical evidence to meet the criteria for our life. And so it is a challenge. But I do encourage you, and I got to be careful with what I'm allowed to say in this space too, but I do encourage you that the historical evidence for Jesus is something that absolutely will transform your life for the good. But I want to jump into Q&A. I'm super curious about what we're going to talk about. There's so much more I could say, but we're going to leave it at that for now and see what you guys really want to push back on or see what you want to push into. And so here we go. Let's have some fun. Yeah. The floor is open. Yeah, so the Gospel of Mark is around 70 AD. And again, there's a little bit of give and take in a couple years. Depends what scholar you're reading. There isn't a massive consensus. Usually there's a little debate about a year or two ago. But the historical evidence for Mark is around 70, 72 AD. Matthew is around 80 AD. And then Luke is around 85. And then John is around 95. Yeah. The book of Galatians is around 80, 55. And a lot of people believe Galatians to be one of the first key historical writings of the church. Yeah. But the key thing to point out with the point there is especially 1 Corinthians 15. That's the key passage that even skeptical scholars will admit this is part of the oral tradition that the church had even before the formation of the gospel writings. That was established already pre-Paul conversion, which happened a year or two after the crucifixion of Jesus. Yeah. Which is a wild historical statement to make. Yeah, great question, though. Mark was the first gospel written. Why is Matthew in front of it? Yeah, that's a really good question. And so when we read the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament, when what's called the canon, which basically canon's a word that means sort of rule of faith. What is the rule of faith for the life of the church? And then certain books were introduced to the church as meeting the criteria historically, evidentially. Was it written by apostle? Back to those two E's, eyewitnesses, early dates were crucial. When it was compiled, the question wasn't necessarily an order of like year to date, this. Where Matthew is first is because Matthew is the most Jewish focused in its perspective of who is it's writing to. Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience with a deep familiarity of the Old Testament. And so much of the Matthew allusion and accounts is written from a Jewish worldview of how to understand this historical reality of who Jesus is. And so that's why the Gospel of Matthew starts with a genealogy. And we as modern readings, we start the New Testament and we're starting with a genealogy and we're like, let's fall asleep now. This is a boring story about Jesus. But to a Jewish person, it's making these massive theological statements that would have been absolutely revolutionary for them to hear. And so Matthew is there to connect the narrative and themes of the Old Testament into the story of Jesus, highlighting the understanding of the New Testament. Yeah, that's a really good question, though. What else we process? And did your hand go up? You just, oh no, I just scared you, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it just gets lost in translation. So if you read it in Greek, the cadence is still there. But as soon as you translate from Koine Greek into modern day English or any other language, you miss the cadence. And it's to do justice to the translation, you can't really keep the cadence, if that makes sense. Because the way we frame and orchestrate our words aren't the same way that the pronunciation of a Greek word would be orchestrated. Does that make sense? So it's still sort of there, but it's only there when you read it in the Koine Greek that it's written in its historical state. Yeah. But it's pretty fascinating to me that oral tradition was established before the conversion of Paul. And that is what it said about who Jesus was. If we want to have a historical question of like, who is Jesus? The very first thing said about Jesus is coming out of 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. Oh, great question. What else we process? And yeah, I'll go Lily and then up here. Yeah.
So you talked about how Jesus' resurrection was the first concept of someone coming back to life after dying.
Yeah.
What about their experience with Lazarus, who died and then was resurrected?
Yeah, so even Lazarus would be, and if you don't know the story of Lazarus, Lazarus was a friend of Jesus who basically passed away, and then Jesus came and Jesus is weeping over his death, and then Jesus resuscitates him back to life. And the difference between Lazarus and the story of the narrative of the resurrection was the story of Lazarus is more of a story of resuscitation. Lazarus would die again. Lazarus wasn't in a state of resurrection. Jesus defeated death and resurrection, where Lazarus was still bound to death, even though he was raised. So there's a distinction between a resuscitation back to life to die again and what we would call resurrection of Jesus' bodily state, never to die again. Yeah. Does that help articulate?
Yeah. So now they would have had a different perspective on life because the way that Jesus resurrected would have not been in like a physical, even though they saw him physically, his body didn't die. So would they have had the concept of this like new body, new earth at that time, or was that later on?
The story that fascinates me happens in Luke 24, where it's the story, it's called The Road to Emmaus, and one of the post-resurrection of Jesus is recorded in Luke 24. And skeptic scholars disregard this, but I'm a Christian, so I still hold it as authoritative. But he's walking out of Jerusalem with these two followers of his who are in mourning and grief. They're like, our Messiah has been killed. Our worldview, everything we hoped and longed for has just come to the end. And they don't recognize Jesus. And Jesus is even, it's sort of comical, the engagement between them two. So I wonder, Jesus' resurrected body, what did it look like? We know that he still had the scars. He still had the holes in his wrists. We know that the disciples and the apostles and Thomas saw the physicality of what he endured on the cross. But at the same time, he experienced it in a bodily form that was, yes, physical, but I think distinct from anything we have seen before. But how to articulate and how to envision that, we don't have categories for. The New Testament doesn't give us categories for that. But that's a really good question, though. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah.
Or should I push into that more?
No, it's good.
Okay.
I think it like just translate that they would have been recreating a worldview based on, because they would have expected that liberation of like a physical liberation from their slavery.
Yeah.
So now if Jesus is resurrected differently,
Yeah.
they're now reforming what does that implicationally look like for us. And now it's just significant. It's super significant because they believed it to the point that they were crucified upside down or sawed in half,
Yeah.
or saw
Yeah.
their family get killed. Like,
Yeah.
it's pretty significant.
Very significant. 100%.
Lillian pretty much asked the same question. I was going to ask you about Elisha's bones resurrecting in the Old Testament.
Oh, yeah.
He was thrown into his tomb as well as Lazarus, and whether the difference was someone was acting on the recently deceased versus basically Jesus bringing himself back.
Yeah. That's a good connection. Yeah. Dayon.
You talked about the written record of the resurrection, and it's like 30 years later, 50 years later.
Yeah.
In today's world, if you don't record something today, it changes tomorrow.
Yeah.
So how was this carried over? So 30 years later, they can still record it correctly. Was it orally?
Yeah, it was definitely the amount of media information in the Greco-Roman world was way more limited than what we have today. In an internet age, we are embedded and thrown information constantly. And you're right, once we receive information, we don't even know if it's true from yesterday. In that culture, again, an oral culture, they had much more of a storytelling perspective. They had much more of a tradition that was passed on relationally, not digitally like we would today. And so when you look at something in that day and age to be recorded within a year is incredibly significant, especially when you talk about the cost of production for even to write some of the letters of the New Testament, to write the Gospels would have been incredibly expensive endeavors. And so there would be a reason, a rationale to spend all this time and money and resources to take these oral traditions to make sure that they are handed down and distributed throughout the Roman Empire. And so it's very different in that sense. And so there was very much more controlled and articulated and focused of what information needs to get passed on and what needs to be recorded for history. Yeah. Does that help? Or is any pushback?
What was the check that they make sure that that's correct, that it's passed on, that the next person is not going to change it somehow?
Yeah, and so that was what's called a scribal tradition. And so what's interesting to me is this was something already embedded in the Jewish worldview before the New Testament came along. And so the New Testament scriptures arose primarily out of the Jewish culture. And they already had a scribal tradition from the Old Testament scriptures, where they would basically have scribes that would come and say, okay, here's what's written here. Let's transcribe. There's 3-4 people in the room giving evidence. This is the word. This is what's copied, articulated. Something that drives me crazy about Bart Ehrman, the scholar I told you, he's a skeptic, but he gives a lot of evidence, New Testament scholar. Bart Ehrman, when he talks about that question, he uses the game Telephone. Has anyone played the game Telephone before? Where you have like 10 people in a row, and then Olivia, you just are pumped to play that game, right? You whisper something in someone's ear, then the next person whispers in someone's ear, and then at the end you're like, oh, what's the final message gonna be? And usually it's like distorted or something different. And Bart Ehrman uses that as an attack against the credibility of the New Testament documents. That's why he doesn't accept all of the Pauline letters. He only accepts about 6 or 7 of them. But what drives me crazy about that is because historically what would have happened in the scribal tradition would have been this person would have told this person, and then the person that told this person would have come with them. So it would have been like, hey, the 2 of us are going to tell this person, and we're going to double check their work. The 3 of us are going to tell this person, and we're going to double check their work. The 4 of us are going to tell this person to double check their work. It was a very articulated scribal tradition that they were functioning out of. And Bart Ehrman, because he's a New Testament scholar, not an Old Testament scholar, misses the cultural moment of what's happening there. Whereas that's something that continues for the life of the church and the early transmission of the New Testament. By the way, we have over 20,000 documents of the New Testament manuscripts, more than any piece of ancient literature. So there's a lot of evidence just for manuscripts research to be done. But yeah, I could rant on that a long time, so cutting you off, Dayon, but good question though. Who else? Yeah. Yeah.
After the resurrection, how does the interpretation of Trinity change?
Yeah, well, the New Testament writers don't use the word Trinity, but they give allusion to it. And the first place we hear the word and concept of triune God, Trinity, comes from a person I actually mentioned a little bit ago, Tertullian, around the 2nd century. And he was the first one to articulate sort of this definition of a triune God, where the early church believed, they're like, okay, we understand God the Father, because many of them were Jews. We have a concept of the Holy Spirit, because we see the Holy Spirit working throughout the Old Testament stories, the Spirit of God falling upon people. They had a category for that. But now that Jesus came into the equation, and they began to realize that if Jesus claimed to be God, which is a whole other conversation, but again, the majority of Christians believe that claim. To call yourself a Christian, you need to believe that claim. Then they began to say, well, how do we frame this understanding of who Jesus is in our concept of a monotheistic worldview religion? And then how did Jesus frame his experience of relationship with God the Father, God the Son? And so Tertullian was really the first person in history to begin to articulate that in written form. Again, it was being transmitted and talked about in the early church, but the early church in its beginning stages were being massacred and killed and martyred. They had no financial resources to begin writing on papyri to articulate these things. But Tertullian comes along, and that's the key person of history to read for the first articulation in written form of a Trinitarian understanding. Yeah. Does that help? Okay, sweet. What's some other thoughts? Yeah.
Is there any other non-Christian ancient literature, apart from Josephus, provide evidence of Jesus' resurrection?
Yeah, I mean, there's 11, so back to Bart Ehrman too, just because he's the main critical scholar. He gives 11 sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. Some names are like tactic, and this is outside the New Testament, non-Christian sources would be the articulation of those 11. So there's many in that category. There's about 12 total, actually. He gives 11, but there's 12. So you could read, and that's just a quick Google. There's like Tacticus. I think you just mentioned Josephus. Is that where? Yeah. Sagittonius, Polycarp. There's a few others. But those are easy. They usually have like a 1 or 2 sentence claim about who Jesus was. Josephus is probably the main person to read. Tacticus says some interesting things about Jesus and the belief of the early Christians. So those are like non-Christian sources that you could deep dive into. What's fascinating to me is Clement of Rome is one of the first writers outside of the New Testament to begin to explain the historical resurrection of Jesus. So Clement of Rome is probably your earliest source outside of the New Testament to deep dive into. And there's a category of what we would call the church fathers or church patriarchs, who are the early initial writers with upholding the rule of faith, the canon of the New Testament. And so there's tons that you could read in that category. And again, the evangelical church, we don't do well in reading the historicity of the church fathers, but movements like the Catholics and movements like the Eastern Orthodox are much more in tune with what the early church patriarchs. That's just a category. There's church mothers and church fathers too, but the primary writers at that point of history was obviously male. But so there's a lot to be read in those sources about Jesus' resurrection too. Yeah, great question though. Yeah.
What are your opinions on the lost gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, James, and the controversial?
Yeah, the reason they're controversial is because, again, we started with this idea of that for something to be credible historically, you need early dates and eyewitnesses. And all those other gospels mentioned are like 4th century on. Now we're talking in the category of what we were talking about with like Alexander the Great, like completely disconnected. And when we look at the early resources for which we have to define and articulate who Jesus was and what he did, these are the source materials we're working with. And so to begin to accept things that are written completely later, that have no historical connection to the apostles, or no historical connection to the rule of faith, the canon of the New Testament, to say that these have authoritative value in them, and even historical value. A lot of scholars will say that they don't even necessarily have historical value in them. And so that's the two key categories, is early dates and eyewitnesses. What gives something historical credibility? Yeah. And when we talk about things like Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, like we're talking about things that are so far removed that they're not even worth addressing in the same conversation. Yeah. Someone who sort of specializes in that area is a guy named Wes Huff. He's out of Ontario. He works with apologetics. So we just had, who was here for Troy two months ago? So Troy works with Wes Huff in Apologetics Canada, and he really specializes in the historicity of documentation and manuscripts, and really works specifically in the field of literature like that and disproving their validity. So that would be a deep dive. If you're interested in that subject, deep dive in that category with him. Great question though. Yeah. Yeah, so like what we would call the Apocrypha. Yeah, so what authority they have? Well, they're in a category that is pre-Christ, so to say. So they're written in what we call the intertestamental period. I'll try not to nerd out on you guys too much, but Old Testament, which we consider the before Christ, New Testament during the Greco-Roman world of Christ's existence and beyond. In between those two periods of history is what we call the documentation of the Apocrypha. And there's some books in there written in the intertestamental period. And most Protestants, if you're Protestant or Catholic, you would say that they're valued in a historical perspective. And even, I've talked to a lot of Catholic scholars too, that a lot of Catholic scholars wouldn't even say they're authoritative, but they find a place in the value of historical understanding. And so they do derive some of their theological statement, things like a theology of purgatory comes from the Apocrypha. But we as Protestants would say they were never authoritative in the life of the early church. And we sort of reject their authority in the life of the church today, but value them as historical documents. Yeah, that's the short, simple answer. But a question of canonicity will deep dive you into that question. Yeah. All right. What else we process and how we doing for time, I guess. Lily, you can tell me when to be quiet, but yeah.
This is along timelines as well, but the book of Revelations, where it says no books should come after this point, do you think that helps with the credibility of the books that come before it too?
Yeah, there's this finality on the statement of canon, where the revelation of Jesus Christ has been made. There's nothing to add anymore. There's an articulation of the early church in defining who Jesus is, and so there is a credibility to the statement that is made sometimes is what's called the closing of the canon, but that language actually drives me crazy. Because the canon, and again, canon is that rule of life. These are the books, historical books that were accepted to articulate the life of Jesus. The canon was never opened to be closed. It was documentation that was realized and recognized by the life of the early church having authoritative value. And so there's nothing to close, so to say. And that's why even we just talked about some of the gospel, like Gospel of Thomas things that come later. The reason there isn't a closed canon, so to say, is because what's authoritative in the life of the church is already established. If we were to find documentation today of evidence of another manuscript that's maybe like 50 AD, then we would have to process that as a church. But we have never found that in all our research of manuscript studies, which again, there's over 20,000 of. So there's been nothing to force the church into that question. And so we don't expect anything to force us into that question. But at this point, there's nothing that would fit the criteria of a rule of faith and canonicity. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you explain why, according to the canon and stuff, why the books of Enoch and books like that were excluded from Scripture?
That I'll just point back to Wes Huff on that one too. That's his specialty, and that's a quick answer. He's got a bunch of YouTube videos on that. Wes Huff. Yeah. That's his specialty, is manuscripts. But the Book of Enoch is a wild read if anyone's read it before. It'll entertain you, that's for sure. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Based on your knowledge, and what would you say at the same time other cultures in this world describe about the resurrection of Jesus? Because when Jesus was resurrected, other big cultures in this world also exist, right? So there's the ancient Babylonian culture, there's Chinese culture, there's other like Eastern culture versus Western culture, but most of the manuscripts that we read is from the Western culture side. So is there any documentation of similar stories of Jesus' resurrection from other cultures around the world?
There are. I mean, that's a whole other massive question too. But even someone like I just mentioned with Thomas, and Thomas going to India, historical records there. I was in Armenia a few years ago, and the apostles that got sent to Armenia, and they view themselves as actually the first Christian nation even before Constantine with Rome. And there's a wild story behind there in Armenia too. So I mean, there's stories of the gospel narrative and the message of Christ risen spreading in all aspects. I mean, the Greco-Roman world, we got to remember too, was massive in that extent. And Rodney Stark, again, the history of Christianity, he's the one that really, in a modern context, defines and articulates that spread in all these different languages and all these different ethnicities and all these different parts of the world. And so Rodney Stark, he has a book called The Rise of Christianity. I think the other one's called The Triumph of Christianity. I think The Rise of Christianity is probably the one that articulates some of those movements to different cultures and different places. But very much so. There's so many traditions around the world that have the historicity of apostle bringing or beyond bringing the message of Christianity there. Yeah. But not right. I'd probably say 200 to 300 AD is when the crazy explosion began to happen. Yeah. Good question, though. Yeah. Then I mean, we're already reading, going back to church fathers too. We're going to Athanasius and Augustine, and we're talking about Africa already in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, having this massive articulation theologically of the gospel and Christ's resurrection. So the church fathers show you the spread of Christianity there too. Yeah. Good question, though. All right. Sweet. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Is there anybody from Africa that had an early church recorded experience?
Yeah, Augustine, the person I just mentioned, was from Hippo. And so he's sort of the first North African theologian. And he deeply affected the theology, especially of the Protestant reformers as well. So he was considered definitely one of the sources of theological insight in the life of the early church. Yeah. It was later. It was like 300s, but yeah. And again, we got to remember the early church under persecution, they had no resources to finance a lot of articulations of the Gospels. So what we see is the rule of life, the canon, being written, and then Clement of Rome is really the one who sort of ignited the writing of the church. And we had theologians begin to pop up, and apologists like Justin Martyr began to pop up, who began to writing to emperors and kings, articulating this statement of what's happening in the Christian world. And so Clement of Rome's really the first, but you can see a progression of it spreading in other voices throughout the empire too. Yeah.
Sorry, I gotta wonder what in the world happened to that Ethiopian scribe in the book of Acts.
Yeah. I mean, that would have been a massive expansion, bringing the gospel back to Ethiopia. Yeah. Well, and the Ethiopian church still exists today and still defines its history connected to him. Right? Oh, yeah. Well, even the Coptic church in Egypt. Again, I mentioned the Armenian church that has existed since 310 AD. Like, and we struggle in Canada because we have such a short and narrow history. But globally, to understand how Christianity has affected the globe is insane to comprehend. Yeah, great questions though. Sweet. Well, that was a lot of fun. Appreciate you all being here.